Dr. Anthony Bendel, the Deputy Privacy Commissioner of Victoria. Welcome, Anthony. We have Troy Braben, the Chief Information Security Officer with Australia Post. We have Alex Wandel, Executive Director and Co-Founder of myempire.com.au. And we have Bartek Manane, a Stay Smart Online Ambassador and General Manager for Moshtix, which is a leading ticketing outlet. And we must thank the Department of Broadband Communications and the Digital Economy, who run the Stay Smart Online website, who have supported this event today. Cybersafety and privacy has certainly been in the news. Just this week, just yesterday in fact, the ACCC has announced that Australians lost $93 million in online scams in the last year, and that's just those that are reported. We've also had reports of a surveillance program called PRISM, which is monitoring and collecting data from online websites such as Google, Facebook, Skype and others for security intelligence purposes. The digital space is now essential in our daily lives, but how do we protect ourselves and our businesses and comply with privacy requirements of the law? Today the panel will be taking your questions, but first let's hear from the panellists. And Anthony, if I can start with you, is there really such a thing as genuine privacy in a digital environment?
Well, the attitude we've always taken is that the argument that you don't have any privacy at all, therefore get over it, which I think one of the leading IT providers said a few years ago, isn't right. And in fact, there are steps you can take to protect yourself, even on those sites that subject to the PRISM program. Certainly, there's not a lot that you can do about national security organisations coming knocking on the door and requiring companies to give information. But that's probably not the leading concern for most people. I think the leading concern is to take the steps you can take to protect yourself from the rest of the world and so that your information is not entirely open for everyone to see. And there certainly are steps you can do to protect yourself in that sphere, and we're keen to encourage people to do that. So I think it's and it's not really the old thing that Justice Brandeis is often quoted as saying, that it's the right to be let alone. I don't think in the 21st century anybody really wants to be let alone. We actually want to be connected and we want to interact with the world, but we want to do it to an extent in a way that where we have some control over how we do that, and it's not just open slather. So, and there are ways you can do that as well. The law helps a bit, and there are techniques you can use as well to do that for yourself. So.
Well, we might come to some of those as we move through the forum today. But Bartek, if I can come to you now, as a small business owner, what kind of protections do you have in place to protect the security of your own business online?
So Moshtix is a leading ticketing agency, and we contain a lot of information about customers, and we're beholden to the Privacy Act, which provides certain legal obligations around the collection, storage and security of data, so we follow those. And also, being an organisation that takes quite a lot of credit card details from customers, we follow the industry, payment card industry data security standards, the PCI DSS. There are many small businesses, and if you could take credit card details or payment details from many people, from customers, that's certainly an excellent set of guidelines to ensure you're protected when collecting customer data.
Now, Troy, Australia Post, extraordinarily large business. What are the key challenges you face with a large organisation, and do you see it as being very different to what a small organisation should be doing?
So, interesting question. Let me answer the second one first. No. Small organisation, large organisation have got the same responsibility and accountability. Certainly Australia Post is large, so 34,000 employees. We hit 11 million homes every day, hundreds of thousands of customers that interact with us online, process over $100 billion in transactions every year. So PCI is massively in scope for Australia Post. So yeah, look, size is a challenge. I think that is probably the major challenge, to be honest. Our business is so fluid, new products, new services, new customers every single day. I think every weekend we seem to be launching a new product or a new service, and certainly our customer footprint expands consistently. So the real challenge is you never stop. You are always doing something new, something different to change your business. Having said that, my role as CISO is kind of twofold. Certainly I've got to protect requirement, which is around understanding our customers, protecting their confidential information, and protecting our business. However, probably part of what it really excites me also is the second part of my role is really the enabling role. So, I want to enable our customers to transact with us online. I want to enable our business to be able to release all of those great new digital and online and social and mobile applications and services. So we can use great security, great privacy principles to help and enable our businesses to do that.
We might hear a bit more about that too, but I want to come to you now, Alex, because you've got a bit of a sad story to tell, which I know you've made it your mission now to share your experience. But small business owner, but you previously owned a business that had an unhappy ending thanks to a hacker. Would you like to share that story with us?
Yeah, it happened actually 2 years ago this week. We lost a business. We went from, the business was Distribute IT, which was a leading domain name registrar web hosting company. Controlled about 10% of the .au domain name market. We had 40,000 hosting clients, sending millions of SMS messages and a bunch of other services. Had a malicious breach on the 11th of June, and that was a 30-minute breach where the hackers got in, and rather than stealing data, they were actually destroying the hard drives in our network. They had control of our network, and they were destroying the data files or data tables on each and every hard drive in each of the CNRAs throughout 3 or 4 different data centres that we operated. They had about 25-30 minutes access, and before we were able to get them out and get control back, wrest control back, and then we went about our disaster recovery plans from there. Over the next 10 or 11 days, we worked through the process of rebuilding a network, restoring services, and basically just trying to get the business back on track. But we ran out of time, and as a result of that, it put our accreditations at risk, or in jeopardy, and we had to move very quickly because it was basically a decision of, do we allow nature to take its course? We'll probably lose our client base because the governing body is going to strip it from us and spread it around to the other registrars, or do we try and buy the extra bit of time we need to finish the recovery of services? And the only way we could do that was to strike a fire sale of the assets with one of the other competitors, and that entire transaction took place in under 12 hours. Between 10 p.m. one night and 10 a.m. the next morning, the handover had taken place. We walked away with a company shell that had liabilities in it, and obviously we were very concerned about a raft of legal sort of litigation issues that might arise. But we went from having a business that was number 3 or 4 in its space in the country, with offices in Melbourne and Jakarta, and 10 days later we had nothing. In fact, we had no homes about a year later as well. So fairly sizable impact. That's the 2-minute synopsis of a much larger presentation that I've been giving, because after about a year it became a passionate thing for me. All of a sudden I realised people need to understand what can go wrong, and it's not just a technical matter. There's a whole of business matter that needs to be addressed in the cyber readiness, basically.
So, obviously you've had time to reflect on this. What actually did go wrong, and what advice can you give business that, to stop it happening to them?
Yeah, there's a number of things that went wrong prior to, with hindsight. You look back and say, gee, we know this went wrong in the week leading into the breach. We know this went wrong during the breach. But everything that went wrong all relates back to the risk and governance structures that we had in place. So without actually having the right business continuity planning in place that allows you to identify some of these potential risks, and it was certainly something that wasn't on the radar. We went through our processes of understanding what risks we had as a hosting company, and one of the big ones for us is stability, because you have a lot of servers and they go up and down, so you focus a lot on being able to mitigate or emit downtime from a specific server or piece of hardware failure. So our processes just didn't pick up in advance that this was a significant risk and that this waterfall effect could actually take place. The biggest lesson for mine is to actually take a very proactive approach to planning out how you would deal with a disaster or a cyber breach, rather than just looking for some prescriptive technologies to stick in front to try and prevent it from happening. Obviously that helps as well, but you do need to have very, very specific plans in place for dealing with a disaster when it happens.
So Troy, I can see you nodding there very much. Is Alex's situation, what happened to him, is it preventable?
If we could solve that, I think we'd make a lot of money, wouldn't we? Look, it's not 100% preventable, but it's certainly detectable and certainly then respondable, if that kind of makes sense. So if you almost take it for granted these days with the lack of a traditional perimeter of an organisation, something is going to happen at some stage. It becomes more of a discussion around detect it, respond to it, execute those DR type processes, how you respond, how you engage the likes of the Privacy Commission to assist, and then it becomes that detect and respond approach rather than purely just block. We are now 100% okay. I think those days are past us.
So Anthony, as you hear that story yourself, what are the sort of things running through your mind in terms of privacy of those clients and what has happened?
Yeah, well, I guess the message we try and push is exactly what has already been talked about having a kind of holistic risk assessment, so that you think about, really, you actually think about the risks and you think about the threats that are there. And the large investigations that I've been part of since I've been working in the Victorian office, and even before that when I was at the federal office and New South Wales office, tend to be where people just don't think about how to handle personal information at all. So often there are other pressures, there are commercial pressures in government, there are political pressures to get large projects done on time and having done yesterday. There tend to be a series of disasters to do with personal information, to do with water in Victoria during that period where it was thought that Melbourne was going to run out of water, and so there was a huge pressure to have those large water-based projects done. So there were a couple of fairly major audits and investigations we were involved in for those projects. And the last thing they thought about really was personal information, yet they were dealing with huge amounts of personal information. And so it is that thing of thinking beforehand and using the guidance that we put out or speaking to us about how you protect. And it's not, in a sense, it's our major concern is personal information, but it's all of your corporate information as well, of course. So our office is about to take on new responsibilities and have responsibilities for data security across government, whether it's personal information or not. And it's concentrating our minds a bit that because we'll have data protection or security or something like that in our title, will automatically become a target for hackers. Not that our information is particularly interesting or lucrative, but people will want to hack in simply because we'll have security in our name. So they want to show they can do it in a sense. So that then raises the stakes as well, so that we'll have to do a bit of thinking about protecting our own, because that would be the reputational risk for a data protection agency of having a major breach kind of really would end it. Certainly you wouldn't be the same staff there the day after, I don't think. So that's one of the things. But it really is that taking a breath and thinking about what you need to do and having in place plans and having policies in place and thinking not just technological answers, but often the matters that we've dealt with, they're usually stuff-ups and they're usually the human factor is the key. And so you need to think about that as well as having whatever technological protections you can have.
Before we go around to the different panels, I'd like just for us to discuss the cloud for a moment. And perhaps Bartek, would you like to have a go at describing what is the cloud? Because we hear about the cloud all the time, and I think that most of us probably are using the cloud without even realising we're using the cloud. So what are we really talking about here?
Okay,
others can jump in as well.
Please. The cloud is basically a set of internet-connected services. So where it really started and what is most familiar to most people is email. So your email is hosted in a cloud environment, which is basically a set of locations sorted by a large company that provides a service to you. A few things have happened that have made the cloud really ubiquitous in our lives at the moment. One of them is the fact that these services are now spread geographically. So where you have your email or anything like that, it's not stored in a central location, it's really stored all around the world. And there's a lot of networking technology that's enabled that to happen. And the next thing is that services have moved from beyond just email to virtually anything. An example on the accounting front is a lot of small business owners are very familiar with MYOB as their accounting package, but there are very strong competitors that provide accounting packages in the cloud. One example is Xero, another one is SaaSU, and even MYOB has now a cloud-related offering. So to store all your accounting in the cloud. And that goes across any service that your business might need, you can get as a cloud-based option. What that gives you is, and the reason that the cloud has become, I suppose, such an advantage for some businesses is, first of all, you don't need physical infrastructure. You don't necessarily need a lot of the IT infrastructure to be able to host these things yourself. When it's for email, as an example, you don't need your own IT server sitting in the corner hosting your email. You use a cloud service. Secondly, a lot of the cloud services that you pay for, such as the ones that I mentioned around accounting, allow you to build on a pay-as-you-go. So you don't have internal infrastructure with some services on there that can handle thousands of users when you only have 3, 4, 5 people using it. And that's what these services provide. And they use those economies of scale to basically run their businesses. I'll let my panellists jump in with anything that I've missed.
Well, I was going to ask Troy, actually, I'll come to you, Alex, but I do know one government department, at least, that refuses to let staff upload anything to like Dropbox or any of those kind of cloud services. What is Australia Post's attitude to that?
So I think the risk-based approach is the one that we tend to take. So there's some great benefits to cloud services like Dropbox, like the accounting packages, even applications as a service, or even just storage platform, whatever it is. There's a whole lot of different benefits. I think there's multiple levels of cloud as well, without trying to get too technical. So certainly, traditional public cloud, those like Gmail or something that's just out there, you never touch it, you never see it. We will define a series of activities and things that are okay to be used in that public cloud service. Other stuff where we want a private cloud, a cloud that we build ourselves that still gives you all of the cloud infrastructure but it's more in our control. We'll have another set of things that is allowable there. Then there'll be a range of things that just can't leave our environment and protected by everything else that we kind of put around it. So look, we do allow storage in cloud, let's call it that, so like the Dropboxes. However, we've got a whole lot of controls about what information is allowed to go out there. Public media releases, fine, put them on the cloud. Confidential board papers, don't put them in the cloud.
Alex, you got something to add? Do you think cloud's a good or a bad thing?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of advantages to the cloud. The biggest catch for the cloud, and certainly for small businesses, is that definition of what is cloud. And I saw last month, I think it might have been, the government came out with a white paper or a positioning statement around their acceptance or acknowledgement that cloud is the way to go, and that they're looking to head down that path. But there was a sentence in there that resonated with me, and that was that they felt that there was sufficient consumer protection laws in place not to warrant putting in specific regulations or controls over cloud environments or cloud providers. And formerly having a public cloud environment, one of the biggest issues there is it's a race to the bottom. Most small businesses, the easiest way to relate to the cloud is that you're probably using a hosting provider for a website, and it might be using a Joomla or a WordPress backend, and you're hosting it with a provider that says we provide a geographically redundant cloud service. Because there's no regulation in place, that geographical redundancy could be that there's a server with VMware sitting in a garage with a blue cable running through the garage, through the garden into their study, and there's a second server where the data goes between those two, and then it's connected through their internet connection. If they're fortunate to have NBN, you won't notice the difference. There's just some specific risks with the cloud that really need to be considered still, given that there's no regulation specifically around the provision of cloud services in Australia.
Anthony, any concerns about our data if it's going up into the cloud?
Well, certainly our office we were one of the first to put guidance out about the cloud, which now is a couple of years old, so we probably need to do it again, I think, because the context has changed quite significantly. But there are some concerns around it. It really is around that level of control that you have and so to the extent you can, what the law requires is you take reasonable steps to protect the information that you've collected or that you hold from misuse or unauthorised loss of disclosure and those sorts of things. And that becomes quite difficult when you don't even really know geographically where it is, and often the process by which you enter into cloud services is all the power and knowledge is in their hands and you're clicking something. So that's really the most generic type of public cloud where it is just a ticker box on a website. It's really quite difficult for you to take any steps really to protect the information, let alone reasonable ones.
So in terms of, is there a way to see, is there an accreditation standard for cloud-based services that people can check to ensure that their data is safe? Alex?
Kind of covered that partially in that previous response, but technically there's no specific standard that's in place that requires a public cloud provider to adhere to. What we are seeing is a lot of larger organisations, and you might be able to answer this one a bit further, but a lot of larger organisations that are using outsourcing to data centres and other providers are starting to do a requirement for ISO 27001 accreditation, which is essentially a accreditation that you've got an information security management system operational or in place, and it gives, I think, give full protection, but it certainly gives some comfort that there's processes and procedures and controls in place to ensure the management of the information that's being held there.
My question was to Alex. Whilst I understand one important thing is privacy and not letting other people steal your information, did you have backup procedures in place when your company was attacked? And if so, if you didn't, would having had backup procedures in place have saved your company because you would have been able to resort to your backups?
Thanks for the question. We did have backup procedures in place. We had quite a number of different procedures. We had a very large virtualised disaster recovery process in place that was pushing snapshots of every single server across devices and across multiple locations in different data centres. The reason we had the end result was not because of a lack of backups. Suitability of those backups in that type of scenario, that's a different question. I think there's certainly some discussion around the suitability of a virtualised DR process in that sort of situation. But the reason we ran out of time is because of human errors that occurred prior to those events that created the situation that the recovery process took so long. And if it wasn't for those, we wouldn't. I certainly wouldn't be sitting here today saying that we lost a business out of it. So most of the end result of our problems were as a result of control errors rather than technical or backup concerns. All hell breaks loose. We actually had a breach a week prior, and we had pretty good monitoring on our networks. We knew that somebody was in our network straight away, and we went into a lockdown mode, and we actually reconfigured our network during that week. But there were mistakes made during that process that enabled the re-entry a week later. The second week when we knew we'd been hacked was when they changed our homepage on our website, and they put a fairly nasty message on there. And then my phone started beeping with all my alerts of all the servers going offline one after the other. And I was scrolling through my external alerts on my phone, every one of them was red. And that happened within about 3 or 4 minutes. The whole lot went down. So if you've got appropriate monitoring, you'll know pretty quickly that something's going wrong.
There are changes happening in March. Those people who follow privacy for whatever reason, aren't paid to do so like I am, may recall that in 2008, quite a long time ago now, the Australian Law Reform Commission undertook its biggest reference ever, and for about a year or 18 months was doing a review of privacy law in Australia, produced an enormous report of 3 volumes and 290-something recommendations to reform the law of privacy in Australia. That's been slowly been implemented, partially implemented at least by the federal government. The most notable implementation is this latest reform. Basically what it's designed to do is, at the moment in the Federal Privacy Act, there's two sets of principles. The information privacy principles, which apply to the Commonwealth agencies, and they were the first set of principles from the 1980s. So settling, tax office, those sorts of organisations. And there's a second set of principles in that Act, the national privacy principles, that apply to private sector organisations that have a turnover of more than $3 million a year. So that what they're trying to do is have one set of principles that apply to Commonwealth agencies and the private sector. Our office has been pretty critical of those principles. The idea from the ALRC was that they'd be made simple and transparent and lucid and all those sorts of nice words. In our view, the opposite has happened. We think the NPPs that apply to the private sector already were pretty straightforward and easy to comply with, or relatively. And they're the same principles that apply to Victorian government agencies that we regulate, because at the time, 2001, when they were legislated, was when the state legislation was happening here. Unfortunately, in the drafting process, trying to amalgamate those two, the new principles are actually quite complicated. And in some instances, it still says, if you're an agency, this will apply. If you're an organisation, this will apply. So they're not actually, in some instances, one set of principles anyway. They're co-located in the Act now, but still different rules apply to the Commonwealth agencies than apply to the private sector. So it's really the complexity of them that is our major concern. And in some instances, they've actually lowered the privacy protection. So that's also, given that the bill to introduce them was called well, I can't exactly remember the words, but it was about improving privacy, and they've done the opposite in some instances. So the major changes are that the transporter data rules are quite different. So that if you send information outside of Australia, and to an extent all businesses do that because of what we were just talking about, the cloud, there's an obligation now that you do that either with consent, and where you know where you're going to send the information, you're meant to tell your customer that, so that they can consent knowing where it's going to go. Again, with the cloud, that's difficult. And we've got a problem with it being with consent, because in a sense, what are people consenting to, and how do you do that? If you can't do it with consent, then you've got to take all reasonable steps to make sure it's still going to be protected as if it were in Australia. And if it's not, and if something goes horribly wrong, you're then responsible as though it was you that did the breach. So that will then mean that, if you send it off to a provider in Tennessee or somewhere and something goes wrong, because the Australians can't recover against that person in Tennessee, they'll come against you. So that's one of the major changes. There are some other changes, but they're more really conceptual, and it's really the complexity we have a problem with.
Our SurveyMonkey is based in Canada, and many people use SurveyMonkey. So if you have to tell everybody in the survey, hey, it's based in Canada, and they go, but they threw me out 10 years ago, I can't do that. Where does that leave everyone?
That's right. One of the other changes with the cross-border, at the moment, the company simply has to satisfy itself that there's a similar set of laws applying in the jurisdiction they're sending it to. The change now is that not only does it need to be similar legal protection, but an Australian would need to be able to recover under that jurisdiction. And that's almost not true anywhere. So that even if you're sending it to Europe, where there are quite stringent rules, somebody from Melbourne's not going to be able to make a complaint to the German Privacy Commissioner and participate in conciliation and do all those things. So it basically means that you'll be responsible if something goes wrong if you send it outside the jurisdiction, unless you somehow manage to make an argument that the person's consented. And that's the concern we have, that if the idea is that Australians be able to have some kind of remedy where their information's been sent somewhere else, if that consent mechanism is too loosely interpreted and just ticking a box and impliedly consenting, it may mean that that principle doesn't have any force at all. And so it may not actually improve privacy protection, it might do the opposite. And that's certainly what the privacy advocates have been saying. They have a real concern about that, because the consent is slightly vague in that principle, so what is it going to mean?
Two things popped into my mind there. Does these privacy regulations apply to all business? Is there like a scale, or, because I can imagine people listening now panicking that, if they're sharing their data, they're going to be responsible for this. So who comes under the Privacy Act?
Yeah, well, basically the Act I, so the Victorian one, it's Victorian public sector organisations, so places like this university, government departments, local councils, and private sector organisations that contract with any of those. So we have some jurisdiction over the private sector if you contract with the Victorian public sector. The Federal Act applies, as I've said, to Commonwealth agencies, and then to private sector organisations, but only if you have an annual turnover of more than $3 million. So small business, the idea is kind of left out. Now there are exceptions to the exceptions, basically, so that if you deal in personal information, so if you're a direct marketer or you're a data broker, those sorts of businesses where your whole business is personal information, then it doesn't matter what your turnover is, you'll be covered by it anyway. So and there are other exemptions like political parties aren't covered. Employee records quite extraordinarily. Usually when I tell people that, they're shocked and horrified if they work for the private sector to learn that anything that's in their employee record isn't covered by privacy legislation, which seems a bizarre exception to me. Apart from your doctor and your life partner, probably your employer knows more about you than anyone, and yet there's no, under HR laws, there might be a reason to protect it, not under privacy law. Journalism and news gathering, there's an exemption for which you can see the reason for that. So that's basically how it works. So if you're a very small business with a less than $3 million turnover and you don't deal primarily in personal information, then you're not covered by the laws. But that wouldn't be, I still think that's not a reason to completely relax, because in the US, which doesn't have comprehensive private sector privacy laws, the way that businesses have been got at there really is that their Federal Trade Commission has basically used their consumer protection laws to go after organisations who say one thing and then don't live up to it. So if they have a privacy policy which says we'll do all these sorts of things and then they don't, they basically seen that as being misleading conduct. And so they've taken action against all sorts of size organisations there. And that's a possibility here. The law is basically similar. So the ACCC could get into their head to do that as well. And I think also there'd be an argument that if you take no steps to protect your customers' information and they suffer really egregious damage from it, they probably wouldn't need to rely on privacy legislation. They'd probably just sue you for negligence about not having, done your due diligence and taken reasonable care of their information. So certainly I think the responsibilities are different, and under the privacy legislation you have to take reasonable steps. So what reasonable steps are, if you're Australia Post, for instance, will be different than if you're a very small organisation with hardly any staff, and that's why it's expressed like that, so it's a sliding scale. But I certainly think, I don't think anybody should think they don't have any responsibility at all. So.
Do you have any sense as to whether the Australian privacy principles are going to be adopted by each of the states? I know the ALRC report had suggested that as a possibility, and I hear you saying your office is not particularly happy with them.
Yeah. Basically, we've been looking at that because what part of our expansion of responsibility really is that our legislation is going to be repealed and replaced with a new act. So one of the things that the government is looking at is whether to have a new set of principles. At the moment, they're minded not to adopt the APPs, partly for the reasons I've just said. We don't think they're very good. In terms of the other jurisdictions, I don't think New South Wales are looking at all changing their privacy legislation, so they won't be. Queensland's doing their kind of 5-yearly review of their privacy legislation, but it started in 2011. I think the committee in charge is yet to meet. So there's probably not a big impetus there either. I think the Queensland government might actually like to repeal their privacy legislation if they don't do anything, and not replace it with anything. But South Australia and Western Australia don't have privacy legislation at this point. South Australia is actually, they've had fits and starts of actually, I've been to meetings since 1998 when I was first involved in this area, where South Australia periodically announces that they're drafting legislation and then comes to nothing. But they're at one of those stages again, and it does seem to have some political will now. And they are looking at whether or not they might use the Australian privacy principles as a model. Our thinking prior to that had been they do what Queensland did, and Queensland had an administrative scheme that the public sector was meant to comply with before there was legislation, and they simply made that into legislation, so that was what they were used to. And South Australia, I think, is tossing up whether they do that or they adopt the federal model. Western Australia is quite stridently not doing anything, so it's unlikely that in the near future we'll see Western Australian privacy legislation. Tasmania and Northern Territory, the ACT already have a scheme. The ACT complies with the Federal Act, and the Northern Territory and Tasmania haven't heard that they're looking at doing anything in particular. So it's still going to be a mismatch. Partly the process by which the Commonwealth went through was simply to focus on their own act, and they didn't get the states involved up to this stage. So there'll be a long, protracted COAG or Standing Committee of Law and Justice Ministers process, one imagines, to really have national harmony. And so I don't see that happening anytime soon.
This question's to the panel. We started off at the start. There was a comment made about the cost of security. So my hat is coming from the business side All right, so I'm a developer, I want to put a system out there. Is the cost of accreditation, standards, security going to stifle competitiveness in Australia? Well, I mean, why can't I just go and put a server out in Asia?
Troy.
I'm happy to answer that one. So, short answer is yes, it can at times. However, that doesn't detract the need to do it. I think, as we talk through privacy legislation, things like ISO 27001 and the other standards, PCI, they are great standards to follow, and they give you some really good kind of guidelines and directions to head in. Having said that, they don't cover everything. They don't meet everything that you need. And so, I think, again, talking about transporter and cloud, yes, you're outsourcing technology, but you're not outsourcing governance or responsibility, and so you've always got that responsibility as an organisation. As I said, my role is about enabling and protecting, so I am absolutely looking for every possible opportunity that I can to enable our developers, our testing teams, to use cheaper services that also maintain a level of security. Just because we're using a cloud provider offshore doesn't mean that I'm getting less security. In some cases, I'm actually getting better security than by keeping it in Australia. Certain application sets, I would much rather trust a global organisation that's invested billions of dollars in R&D and has great security than a small startup in Australia, because that's the only option. And so I think it's just responded on us to find the right solutions, the right cost, the right everything that matches kind of what the business needs to do.
When you say responded on us, you mean Australia Post, right? So
on each individual organisation. So so that's my day job is that. Yeah. My night job is my wife and I run a small business ourselves. So a business of one. The wife. It's an online
consultant, right?
I'm the warehouse manager. It's an online wine business, right? And so as an organisation of one, we are still customer data, taking financial transactions. It is still respondent on us as that entity to keep our customers secure and our data secure. And so to the point, different levels. Certainly my security budget at Australia Post is different than my security budget.
I was just going to say that.
Right? But it's still exactly the same requirements, and so I still need to make sure both businesses are secure.
Thank you.
Can I say one little thing?
Yes, please.
And again, direct experience and with the recent legislation going to Parliament for mandatory data breach reporting, what I can say is the cost of protecting an organisation is relative to its size. But the cost of protecting an organisation is less than the cost of the proposed fines, and that in turn is far less than the economic cost that you will suffer if you don't do it. So I would suggest that rather than, and I think, and 3 years ago, same boat. We're in a highly competitive market where the margins on a domain name registration have reduced from $40 over 2 years to $1.
Yeah.
Hosting providers have reduced their pricing from $20 a month for a basic website down to $2 a month. That investing in some of these things was just impossible, in our opinion. It was very, very difficult, and it would have potentially made us uncompetitive, or it would have just potentially made us unprofitable. So it's certainly a difficult decision, but if you go with the mindset that I have to take protective measures, and obviously relative to my business, and knowing that there's now some fines that might be thrown at you, and but the bigger picture is that there's obviously a much bigger loss that's at stake.
There are useful things in something like the PCI compliance standards, which allow you to almost test the person you're consulting with or the company that you're using to check that things are done according to a certain process. And it goes back to other questions. One that was asked earlier: how do you know that you've been hacked? Well, generally you know because the hacker has made some kind of a public message on your website, as an example, but in some cases there may be no traces at all, and that then goes down to your monitoring systems. So how do you know that the IT consultant that you're using has put in place a monitoring system that will actually catch these? In a lot of cases it's difficult to know that, but there are guidelines within some of those processes, some of those ISO standards that we mentioned earlier, and some of the PCI compliance ones, that help you as a business owner have some level of checks and balances against what your provider is performing.
So is that a certificate or something? Can you ask your IT consultant to say, show me your PCI compliance?
PCI compliance is a set of processes that are more for the business themselves. So the IT provider, I'm not aware, would be providing services in a PCI compliant fashion. But these sorts of questions straight away will help separate the reputable companies from the ones that don't. If you're dealing with an IT provider that says to you, I have no idea what PCI compliance is, that's probably not a good sign. But one that has that level of understanding around legal obligations and around privacy, around data protection, these are some of the things that you as a business owner can use to test that knowledge.
Troy?
So for the startup business that doesn't have a strong background in technology or security, I'd ask two questions. The first would be, can you show me your privacy policy? An organisation that's got one has actually spent some time thinking about it. One that doesn't, I'd run away from. And then the second question I'd ask would be, how are you securing data? And I can guarantee in 98% of the good cases, they will have a one-page PDF or a two-page document or something that they will send to you. If you get those two things, you've kind of got a level of assurance. Then from that, if there's any red flags, go and talk to someone. There's plenty of organisations out there that will provide kind of consulting services, but more specifically, just some general practical advice on who's good and who's not.
Ideally, that would be, in a perfect world, fantastic. The biggest problem is, I guess I'm fairly unique that I'm talking about it because at the end of the day, I don't have a brand to protect anymore. Whereas in most cases, the end result isn't as drastic as ours. Economically, financially, certainly in the case of larger organisations, the dollar value is far greater. But you won't find, I don't think you'd find too often a CISO or a CIO or a CEO coming out saying, here's how it went horribly wrong. The last thing they want to do is reiterate the fact that it went wrong and they got breached. So it's a difficult one. We can glean some of that information from media reports, but from personal experience, I know the media reports that were written about our situation were completely wrong. They were based on what the journalists were reading on the Whirlpool forums. So unless you've got people willing to come out and actually invest the time to say, here's everything we learned, unfortunately at this point in time, I'm the only one I think that I know of that's out there doing that. So, and we are over time between presenting and everything else, trying to put something together. It's a bit more sort of documented and meaningful because there are a lot of lessons to learn from that situation, going across a whole range of business concerns. Insurance is a really big one I talk about a lot. So, yeah, unless we can get people that have been breached to actually stand up and say, yep, here's the case study and here's the information, it's very hard to, I think, to put all that together. And I certainly wouldn't want to do it based on just media reports.
Thanks, Alex. Anthony?
Yeah, I think one of the motivations for the bill that's before Federal Parliament for data breach notification laws is that. The main motivation is so that if there's a data breach there, people's welfare is put at risk, either financial or other welfare. They get warning so they can take steps to protect themselves. So if their credit card details have been compromised, they can change their credit card or whatever. So that's the main motivation, and so that you have to tell your customers about it. But you also have to tell the Federal Commissioner. So part of that, I think, is so that there is some kind of overview of patterns and what's been happening to businesses and what could be done to better protect them. Now, whether the Federal Commission is going to be resourced well enough to then produce some guidance out of that, I think would be an open question, but certainly one that I think the federal government should be asked. But that's one of the, I think, ideas that will be, because it won't be public as such, but it'll be to the Commissioner. It'll allow them to have a view of a bigger picture than they've got at the moment. So. Generally not, because generally the state laws apply to the government agencies in each of those states. So if you're contracting with a private organisation in Australia, they're either going to be, they generally will be covered by the Federal Act. So wherever they are in Australia, that will be the case. So And to an extent, the geographic location is important, and we got quite a lot of attention when we put our guidance out, because we did talk about the Patriot Act and other US national security laws that have been even more talked about in the last couple of weeks. And got a bit of flack from the Federal Trade representative in Washington saying that we were anti-Australia-US trade. But our staff were thrilled that the Federal Trade representative in Washington was reading our guidance. But that wasn't our idea, in fact, and I think we've already touched on it, that in fact you do a holistic risk assessment. So if there's a reputable US provider that looks as though they tick all the security boxes, but there's that national security question, and you line them up against a local provider who looks as dodgy as, then we certainly wouldn't advise that you go with a local provider. But there are reputable local providers or overseas providers who have data centres in Australia, and so all of those things are things to take into account at the time you're choosing a provider, basically. So.
Yeah, it's certainly a consideration if you're unsure. In a lot of cases, providers would say we host in data centre XYZ, and most data centres have physical security-wise are very good. The issues with cybersecurity are more what you can't see, and that sort of leads to the next question of, well, how do you find out whether they're protected, whether there's security measures in place, and that's obviously a much harder answer to give. But look, if you're not sure, then absolutely you want to get a walkthrough of the physical environment to see what's in place and ask a lot of questions. But that's only one level of what you need to be considering in all of this. That is an excellent question, and hindsight is a wonderful thing. How best to answer that? That is a very good question. I think if there's two, in my mind, from our incident, there's two specific things that occurred, and both of those things that occurred that created the opportunity and created the delays in the recovery time, and both of those relate to spending the time as a team looking at disaster planning in a broader context. We always, and most companies still have this theory that cybersecurity or online security is an IT issue, and we probably were guilty of that as well, saying when there's a breach, our IT guys will have to recover the services, and when it's back up and running, everything else takes place, gets back into shape, and away we go. I think the very first step, if you've got a process in place, to consider the broader impacts of if you have any event that creates an outage or a breach of data that creates the inability to trade for an extended period of time, how would the business deal with that? How do you pull the right resources in to recover the various, to communicate with the media? How do you pull in the necessary resources to fill the breach if you haven't got enough people technically to be able to restore the services in a timely manner? So I think you would know that you are reasonably well covered if you are diligent enough to have a process in place every month, every quarter, that goes through looking at risks of the business. And I know for a small business, 1 or 2 man band, that's a difficult thing to do, and that's where it's good to go to your providers or to engage some external consultancy if budget permits. But you will know if you are starting to get to the point where you're very proactive in your planning and approach in terms of, if disaster strikes, this is what I'm going to have to do, this is what they're going to do, this is how we're going to communicate it, and you're starting to put together a documented set of processes, because that'll help you identify the risks and also prepare you for how you're going to deal with them if or when it does happen.
Troy, these are the kind of things that keep you up at night?
Yeah, they do. So I agree with everything that was just said then. The next step, so important to document. The next step, though, is test it. To be honest, how do you know if it works? Test it. So if you've got a backup and a storage disaster recovery plan, pull the plug out of your main storage unit and see what happens, and then execute your plan and test it and see if it works. you'll find out pretty quickly what doesn't work, and then you can make changes to it. So that testing cycle is just critical, honestly.
Is that something that's commonplace in your own business? Are you running these pre-tests? Have you got a plan?
Yeah, we do, and definitely I agree with all those comments. It's a big thing to simulate a disaster, and you're not always going to get it right each time. And it's quite a huge business disruption as well. What's interesting to me is that every time we've done that, we've found something new. We've found something that, we either need to update our documentation in a particular way or change our processes in a particular way. I can't say that all the times we've done one of these tests, which we've been doing for years, has been entirely flawless. There's always been something that we continue doing, which shows just what would be the case if we hadn't been doing this testing. We'd be in a situation where our recovery time would be extended, and potentially would be some data at risk as well.
Well, we've got a couple of questions that came in advance that we haven't covered this yet, and one was from someone who's running an accommodation business, which is currently on the market. They've kept the names, addresses, phone numbers and dates of stay of all the guests that they've had over the past 7 years, so 7 years worth of data. At the very least, they would like to pass on to the new owners the details of the guests who have stayed with us on more than one occasion. And certainly they'd like to pass on details of guests who are booked to stay in the future. In relation to the obligation to guest privacy, what records can they pass on to the new owners? Anthony?
Basically the way privacy legislation works is that you can use and disclose information for the primary purpose you collected it for. So clearly they collected the information to provide accommodation service, or for a secondary related purpose that the individual would reasonably expect. So it seems to me in this case, certainly the people that are booked to come and stay at the place, I would argue that's almost the primary purpose that they need to disclose to the new service provider, so these people don't turn up and are not expected. So that would seem to be a worse outcome than disclosing their information. But even for the people who are regular customers, I think that probably there is an argument that would be a secondary related purpose that they would reasonably expect. So that if all the new owners are going to do is let them know that there are new owners and that they then would have to comply with the marketing laws, which mean that on whatever they send them, they'll have to put, if you don't want to be contacted by us again, tick this box, then that's all that'll happen, basically. They'll get the one notice from them, and if they don't want to hear from them again, they'll be able to tell them that. So it seems to me that would be permissible under the privacy legislation, presuming that they're covered by it, if the turnover is less than $3 million, they're not. But it's just general good business anyway that would be the case. And really, the real secret with privacy is people don't like surprises. So that the real key is the way you collect the information is to tell people what you're going to use it for, who you're going to tell, and those sorts of things. And then the way the legislation works is that those things are done okay, provided you've been upfront with people at the beginning. So if they've covered that off, then that shouldn't be a problem, basically.
Which leads to another question that came in earlier, which was about, we all do it, something comes up, the box says, do you accept these conditions? And of course, I don't know how many people in the room actually read everything that's in there. You just go, I accept, because they're in a hurry. So what are we agreeing to when we say I accept or I agree? Maybe Bartek, with mosh ticks, if I go I agree, what am I agreeing to?
You're agreeing to hear about a lot of great events coming up in your area. So, generally for those, where you have those disclaimers, it's about what can that company do with your information. So can they use your data to target a particular office from that company? What you need to be aware of is where they share that data with third parties, and it's whether it's the related third parties or totally unrelated third parties. That's usually one of the big concerns there. It goes into, I suppose one of the biggest ones there is social networks. Social networks are probably not known greatly for their privacy controls, and ultimately what you're doing signing up to a social network is you're giving them your data to target you for advertising and other bits and pieces. So that's just something to be aware of. But generally it's about what can that company do with your data.
And Troy, from Australia Post, 34,000 employees, bringing in USBs, downloading all sorts of things, wanting to sign up programs. Does any of that kind of thing worry you from either a privacy or a security perspective?
Yeah, that keeps me up at night. Absolutely. And again, I think I talked earlier about the traditional kind of perimeter where an organisation stops. it's irrelevant these days with things like USB certainly, but social is a great example. So even if you block access to Facebook or whatever it is from your corporate network, people will still access it via their smartphones or their iPad or whatever it is these days. Block that, they'll then find something else to use it, so it's kind of irrelevant. Which is where it then becomes much more about education, to be honest. So, Australia Post was the first organisation to sign up to Stay Smart Online. Every user has the Stay Smart Online icon on their desktop. Double click it, goes straight to the website. We deliver a whole lot of practical tips for our people that they can use great services like that. So I think that the days of stop block are kind of gone now, and you really do need to invest heavily in educating the people.
Anthony, the I agree section, is that where all the privacy information should be?
Well, I guess from our point of view, what the responsibility is to take reasonable steps to notify people about what you're going to do. So my view would probably be a little more rigorous than that and say that there should be kind of just-in-time notices as well, so it's not one-off, and so that whenever someone's doing something, there's some kind of notice. Obviously, you don't want them to be bombarded with pages and pages of information every time they undertake a particular transaction. But I don't have jurisdiction over the private sector by and large, but if we did, I think to be perfectly honest, the regulators have dropped the ball slightly on those privacy notices. I don't think lots of them are reasonable steps to inform people what you're intending to do or who you're intending to tell, because they are 35 pages of legalese. So the Victorian government organisations that I regulate don't tend to do that. They do actually, I think because we are a bit more rigorous, they do actually, by and large, do tell you what they're going to do with the information and who they're going to tell. The private sector, I think, could be pulled up a bit more about, okay, if you have your disclaimers in that legalese to, satisfy yourselves, do a version of it that people can actually understand. Otherwise, I don't think you've taken reasonable steps to notify them. So I don't think that's been tested, certainly not in Australia, before a court. But if it was, I think that it's difficult to see how it is taking reasonable steps to really notify people to put multiple pages of gobbledygook. So I don't think people should take too much comfort if they've just done that and thinking that they've actually complied with the law. I'm not sure they have. So.
Troy, you've worked on the national policy front as well, one of the founding members of the Australian IT Security Expert Advisory Group, very long title, providing IT security advice, and I like this one, to the Critical Infrastructure Advisory Council on Australia's national critical infrastructure. There's also criticals in there. What kind of things are on the national agenda from that perspective in really, what are people talking about at that level?
So I think a lot of it is the applicability of some of these things. So yes, legislation is absolutely important and it's a vital part of what we need to do, but it's not the be all and end all. Again, to the point just then, me as a user, so forgetting my job, if I sign up for a Facebook or something like that, there's no way I'm going to read those 60 pages, and Apple's horrible, and so I'll agree, ignore that, but then the first thing I'll do is go in and actually play around with the settings and try to find out what I can and can't do, rather than just accepting the default. So that's kind of, it's talking about things like that we can make people more aware of. There are some good privacy settings in Facebook. If you go and turn them on, they're just not turned on by default. And very similar with a lot of other services. And so look, that's important. Certainly, a lot of discussions about things like cross-border sharing of information is a big challenge. There's no doubt about that. I think we as a nation are understanding what is important to us better. What is our critical infrastructure? What is important in the case of emergency? And so, what are the steps then that we need to take to protect that critical infrastructure as an economy? That's very important. I think, and the last one is that I'm passionate about, I guess, is how to simplify everything, because there's a whole bunch of information out there, which is great, but people can't get access to it. People don't understand it. I'm not going to sit down and read a 20-page document, but I will read, the 8 words sent in a tip to me via email every day. So how do we find those simple things like the Stay Smart Online service that we can use?
Well, that's a good throw to you, Bartek, I think, as the Stay Smart Online ambassador, amongst other things. So what are the top tips that you would give business owners around how do you protect yourself? What should they be doing?
Sure. So the Stay Smart Online basic website is run by the Department of Broadband and the Digital Economy. And it provides a set of practical tips that you can take as consumers and business owners that are interacting with the internet. So we all need to be online. We hope that our lives are enriched by accessing a lot of these services, but it's being able to be online with confidence. Whether those tips are around using different passwords, using strong passwords. I know many of us are very complicit in reusing the same password over and over again because that makes things a lot easier for us, but there's some trade-offs there. It's around how we share information on our social networks, how we collect information as businesses. So there's a lot of really practical tips there, and I really recommend check out the site. There's a section there for small business owners in particular, which covers really practical things that you can do to, first of all, improve your ability to service your customers online and make sure that your consumers are dealing with you with confidence.
Alex, what would be the top tips you would give small business owners in particular?
The biggest one for mine would be actually consider governance. Governance for most small business owners is seen as the realm of big business, and I think take a step back and actually consider your own governance and your own processes, and actually if you drill that down, start to almost work through every line of your P&L and say, what can go wrong and how can I address that in advance? So plan, prepare, test. I think they're probably the three things: plan, prepare, test. Make sure that there's accountability for any providers that you are engaging with, but ultimately accept that it comes back to yourself as the business owner or director, and just keep reiterating those words to yourself: plan, prepare, test. And if you do that very regularly, you'd be in a much safer environment than you were previously.
Troy, what are the sort of things you're telling your team?
So two things probably. One is educate yourself. So congratulations to everyone that's attended today. You clearly are educating yourself. But I think this world changes and evolves at a speed that is quite amazing. It's impossible for me to keep up, and I live it and breathe it, right? And luckily in my day job I've got people that are out there trawling things and giving me summaries and so forth. So I'm lucky from that respect, and I still find it hard to keep up. Having said that, there are some really simple things that you can do, like the States Mail Online service, but also there's plenty of others out there. So I think spending some time to really understand, and it doesn't need to be at a really deep level, but I think reading one document every month is kind of really useful. The second one then, as a small business owner, and that's obviously what my wife is at home, is to expect more from your providers and partners. So ask those questions. If you're using Australia Post to do delivery, ask your Australia Post account manager, how are you keeping my data secure, and hopefully you get the right answer. Let me know if you don't. And so I think starting to raise the bar, expect more as a small business owner. You don't need to be the expert in everything yourself. You should be able to rely on those people that you are paying for their services to keep your data secure, keep your customers secure, etc. So I think raising the bar with expectations is a big one, and that's certainly something that we're doing in Australia Post. All of our providers we are talking to more and more regularly.
And finally, before we use our links, Anthony, what's the one piece of advice you'd like to leave people with?
I think basically what's already been said about preparing and planning and just thinking about it. I mean, the big data breaches and investigations we've conducted really have been because the human factors failed. So, and it's not just electronic information either. So to keep in mind that if you've got things on paper, that things can go wrong as well. One of the most celebrated things that have happened at the time that I was Deputy Privacy Commissioner was a very large government department selling a filing cabinet in disposing of furniture and it ending up in a second-hand shop in Hoppers Crossing full of corrections files with graphic photos of deaths in custody and all sorts of things in it, and they found out when Channel 9 rang them. So that's, I can say that because it is in the public domain. So that's born in too. So it's, things can go wrong, probably will go wrong. So it's best to try, to the extent you can, thinking about what they are and what you can do about them beforehand. So, yeah.
Well, on behalf of everyone today in the Centre and Deakin University, can I thank our panellists? It's been very enlightening. Dr. Anthony Bendall, the Deputy Privacy Commissioner of Victoria, Troy Braben, Chief Information Security Officer with Australia Post, Alex Warndell, the Executive Director and Co-Founder of myempire.com.au, and Bartek, my name, Stay Smart, Online Ambassador and General Manager of Moshtics. And thanks everybody for joining in, and your questions have been wonderful. Thanks everyone.